Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris for this acrylic painting tutorial. Today I'm going to be showing you how to easily paint autumn Indian corn step by step from start to finish. So let's get started. The surface I'm using today is an MDF panel, which is a wood fiber product. And because it is a wood fiber product, I'm treating it the same way as I would any other wood surface. I'm using an 1.5 inch short choice flat brush to seal the surface with a multi-purpose sealer. And this is just going to protect it, and it will provide a much smoother surface to paint on. And that will even help your brushes to last longer if you're working on a smoother surface. I love this short wash because it's a larger brush. It's a very soft bristle. It applies the medium smoothly and evenly. Love the MDF. It's a great product. You can easily see where it's covered and where it's not. Just takes a short minute. It's well worth the time. I am using the 3/4 inch oval wash to apply a base coat of black plum, and I'm using a slip slap technique using the side of the brush, not the chisel edge. So I'm laying it down and flipping it over and laying it down and flipping it over. You will get a nice brushed effect in the background, but it's not solid and heavy. Switching into red spice and blending that up into the purple, they look beautiful together. One works well into the other, and I'm not very particular about keeping them separate. In fact, if you blend them together nicely, it's going to be a much nicer effect. Now, don't be too worried about the first coat. It's always going to be a lot thinner. Doing the same thing with the second coat. Be sure to use moisture in your brush to make the paint movable and fluid and not heavy and solid. We're staying away from that on this particular project. And quickly putting it on. You want to work quickly. If you're not a fast painter, you can use a mister and lightly mist the surface to keep the paint movable, and just do that same slip slap, kind of joggling, picking up a little bit of black plum if it's too orange, to get a nice autumn, that rich effect that we're going towards. Now I'm painting in real time, but I did take out the dry time. This is what a close-up of the effect that you want to get. I know it's a little bit hard to see when the camera's backed off, but you can see the movement, how fluid it is in the background. Very nice effect. Still using that 3/4 inch oval wash, and I've loaded raw sienna on my brush. Just going to base coat the Indian corn. Again, it's not a solid heavy coat. It's just a lot of moisture in the brush to move the paint easily. I can work that. Looking for even coverage, not solid heavy coverage. There will be quite a few applications of paint to build the corn, so this is just step number 1. And I'm using long strokes so that I don't have a stop and start mark in the middle of the cob. So just keep that in mind. Keep them long, smooth strokes. Probably still be able to see the background through just a little bit. I'm going to jump back up to the top of the corn, and I'm picking up some burnt sienna, and I'm staying on the chisel edge of that 3/4 inch wash, the oval wash, and I'm just using it to create the shape of the leaves. But I decided at this point that that was a little bit big and bulky, so I went with the number 5 radical round. Just get a little more control in those tight spots down there above the corn. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. These are super loose strokes. They're not anything particularly fussy. I didn't even trace on a line drawing. I just want to stroke that in nice and loose. Let that background still be visible. Let those dark colors work. It's such a relaxing way to paint because you don't have to be fussy. There is just not a bad thing you can do to this too, unless you overwork it. So just go ahead and keep it loose. Now I'm working with raw sienna to add a little bit of color in those corn shocks. No, this is the husk. I always get those mixed up. So I'm using my number 10 filbert, staying on the chisel edge and kind of flipping over to the width of the brush. This is a great way just to add just a little bit of a highlight on again, we're not being fussy, just to create the shape of the husk and add just a little bit of color. And you can still see that background showing through, which is giving that depth. Just a nice look. It looks like a big cluster. Don't forget to do the binding across the top. That's going to pull that together. Picked up just a little bit of yellow ochre. It's very thin. And I know it looks bright on camera, but it's very thin. Clean my brush. And I'm just softening the edges so that it's not a sharp, bright yellow stripe down the center. And when that dries, it'll tone down. All acrylic paint tones down tremendously. I was looking for a stencil or something I could use to create the corn. I found this. These are one of our collage stencils. Absolutely love them. Just going to put my painter's pal there just to kind of mask off the edge. You can use tape. Loaded my Spectacular stencil brush with persimmon. Wipe it over a piece of paper towel just to get rid of the excess, and I am just going to stencil over that. And I love this stencil. It's not perfect, it's not exact, but this is a very rustic design, so using a stencil that has different shapes in it, I think really adds to that effect. You want to definitely make sure that the Indian corn, that the rows of corn go across and straight up and down the cob. So you'll have to do each one individually, reposition the stencil. If you want to anchor it down with a piece of painter's tape to keep it from moving around, that's great as well. And this is more or less a swirl kind of dry brush. I don't want to say dry brush because I'm applying a fair amount of paint. You want it to be visible. And if you look at the corn cob itself, it has a lot of different colors in the background. This is all going to work together beautifully for the corn as we create it. I have loaded my number 6 filbert with some persimmon, and I'm just going to kind of hit and skip. Indian corn has different colors in it, so I'm just going to hit and skip here and there. Actually, this is persimmon. The colors are random and just kind of fun to pick and choose where you want them. Just make sure they're not too much the same. And I decided just to hit and skip around a little bit. You can always go back and add more, change the colors of them. The paint is fairly thin. I'm not painting exactly over top of that shape. I'm just kind of popping some color in there. Just here and there. I was kind of dreading painting the corn, but it turned out it was really easy and a lot of fun. Love the way it turned out. And just kind of go down wherever. There's no wrong way to do this. And it's kind of crazy how it all comes together so easily. The only thing we're looking for at this point is getting this color on all the cobs randomly over the cob. So it's not just a bunch in one area. It's all just kind of scattered about. I am using Red Spice is the next color I'm going to put on. And I'm going to do the same thing, just kind of hit and touch different colors. It's really nice. This helps also to bring all those colors together that you're using on this design. It just makes it very cohesive and coordinate very nicely. And this is in real time, so you can see it doesn't take a lot of detailed painting. I'm just kind of laying the brush down on the left side and pulling it across. I don't mind that it's not perfect on the other side because we do have that nice underlay of persimmon beneath it. And this is where you start to get some nice color on these kernels. Not a big decision where to put them, but it's kind of fun too. And if you're having trouble, squint, and you can kind of see where you may have missed an area that you do need to add a couple touches of color to. I love the way this stencil turned out. I was pleasantly surprised. I was looking for a more exact kind of an oval kernel size stencil, but this one I think even looks better than what a perfect stencil would have. Just going to keep hitting and missing here and there. If you would like a downloadable pattern, check below. I do have those available, e-patterns, on my website, and there is a link below, so be sure to check that out. Everything I'm using is available at my website, www.cdwood.com, as well as a lot of other goodies. Now, if you think it's starting to look kind of cartoony, it's because we still have a lot of shading and highlighting to add. And I think that's what is so amazing about this style of painting. It comes together so rapidly all at once. It's just, I call it almost like magic. I am using thinned black plum. It's the same color we used in the background. Over top that persimmon, you get just a really nice, rich kernel color. And you need that diversity on these cobs to make it work well. I probably did not put as many black plum. And remember, this is very thin. It's going to dry a little bit darker, so you don't need a solid coverage. But I didn't add quite as many of these because I didn't want it to overpower. And once you start doing this, it's like you get on a roll, and you can do quite a few. If your brush is loaded correctly, starts to drag, you just don't have enough water. And just kind of fill it in so you have some darkness throughout. I think that's the best way to explain it. Just needs to be very diverse. I probably added a little more on the right, the cob on the right, because this one's more in the darkness and I thought it should be a little deeper. Just looking at it now to see if I need to even it up any. And if you have some areas that are not stenciled with the kernels, you can still pop some kernels in there, here and there. That's what I'm doing now, just adding a few here and there just to continue that look of the corn. Now we do have some of the husks that will be coming down over the top of the ears of corn. So I don't have to worry too much about that space up there. I let that dry and have some nice color on there. I have loaded the toe of my 1/2 inch angle with some burnt sienna, and I'm just going to shade around the outer edges of the cobs. And it's around, the right side is going to be a little bit heavier than the left side, but this is just to add some color and start to build dimension on these cobs. It's not a heavy float. I have a lot of water in my brush to push it around. I'm not doing a real smooth float. We've got the rows of corn and they're going to not be smooth and even. So it's okay if your shading isn't smooth and even. It just kind of helps work with the texture of the corn. And that area in there is just going to be dark because it's kind of tucked in behind that other cob. And you can see how wet my paint is. I can even go back to the prior shading and kind of play with it a little bit more. Now I've loaded my number 10 filbert with the burnt sienna. That's the color that we use to apply that first layer of husks. And I'm just going to pull some down around the ears of corn and just kind of let those not be exact but kind of random. Everything here is just loose and flowing. And the ends of the husk can be a little bit split. I think that gives a little more character and personality. So don't try to, have these perfect little flowing husks. They can be kind of shaggy because they're been in the fields. Now I did load the toe of my 1/4 inch angle with bleached sand, and I'm just going to touch some highlights. It's going to be mostly down the middle couple rows because those are the highest point on the cobs. And again, this really looks super bright, but it's very thin. And as it dries, it's going to tone down a tremendous amount. Now this cob in the center is more of a focal point. So I'm putting a little more highlight on this one because it's the closest, it stands out the most. So it's going to have more highlights on it. I skipped the part up on the top left because it's going to be shaded from that husk that's hanging down. As you go toward the bottom, it's going to be a little smaller and not quite as bright of a highlight. So we'll just let that kind of taper off tiny down there. And you can see that started to dry and it's lost its impact. I have a lot of water, a fair amount of color, but and you can tell I'm just touching it on, and just a touch and a pull with a little bit of a curve, and you'll still maintain that kernel shape. And I do this quickly, but I still have good control over where it is being applied. Tiny, tiny as you get toward the bottom. This area over here is going to have some highlights, but it's going to be a bit more shaded. Maybe there's just a little bit here. You have to think about how the light hits it, and the light is coming from the top left, so it's going to be hitting the middle, tapering down in brightness on the sides. I picked up a little bit of the raw sienna on my number 10 filbert and just same thing we did with the husk above, just adding a little bit of highlight on there, just enough to brighten it up. Don't cover it completely, just to enhance the shape and brighten it up is all we're looking for at this point. I love that you don't have to be fussy with it. It just is so much freedom in painting. I have some burnt sienna on the toe of my brush. I'm adding a little bit of a deeper shadow right underneath the edge of that husk that is hanging down. And as before, I'm using a lot of moisture in my brush. Load the toe with the raw sienna. Use the brush to just scoot down underneath that husk and probably have paint just loaded on maybe a quarter of the toe, and the rest of the brush is just clean, so I can use the heel of the toe to kind of spread the paint around a little bit. And this is going to create more dimension underneath. I thought I needed a couple little quiet husks hanging down in the background just to kind of fill that empty area up a little bit. So I'm using raw sienna and a touch of that burnt sienna with a touch of that raw sienna. Okay, back to the shading, just to kind of crisp up that edge a little bit and just smooth that shadowing out just a touch. Already it's added quite a bit of dimension. And loading black plum in my 1/2 inch angle to define these areas a little bit stronger at the top. It's going to be tight where the binding is, so I've kind of scooted my brush along the top edge, but I pulled it up, and I'll do the same thing on the bottom. Scoot it across the bottom and then pull that paint down in between where it's gathered, so you get more texture, more shading, more shadowing. It's just a really great way to add shading without being super particular. This is a very rustic painting. It takes a lot of pressure off. Loaded some black plum on the toe of my number 5 radical round, and I'm just creating a little bit of texture running down those husks that are hanging down. Just a very light touch. This is thin paint, and I just want to create that look that there is texture in those, same as up above, and we're working in a smaller area, so I just bumped it down to a smaller brush just so this can be defined just a little bit more. And now I'm going to take that 1/2 inch angle with black plum. I'm going to shade the top going up into those where they're still hooked to the cob. It's going to be dark in there. And use the toe of my angle to sharpen some of those edges a little bit. And keeping the heel up in the air, that keeps the heel clean, so I can still use it to float. Putting a little bit of that black plum underneath the husks, on the husk. Okay, I went with yellow ochre, and I kind of skipped this part on the camera. I apologize, but just adding some yellow ochre with my number 5 radical round. If you're not familiar with this brush, it's an awesome brush, has a fantastic point on it, has a nice belly so it can hold quite a bit of paint. You can use the point for fine lines. You can press down and get dry brushing, but we're just adding that highlight of yellow ochre. Kind of turns these husks a little bit golden without diminishing all those colors that are underneath. They just work well together. The light is on the top left, so we're going to keep that in mind as you apply these highlights. Top left's going to be a little bit stronger. And I can stay on the toe and get nice fine detail. I can press down a little bit and get some wider kind of raspier strokes. This brush is so tremendously versatile. I use this is my go-to brush for so much. Not doing continuous straight lines because I think that makes it look too smooth. Use my finger to soften it. Don't be afraid to use your fingers. They're great tools. You don't want it choppy, so I'm just kind of smudging it so it looks a little bit more rustic. Rustic is my new favorite word. And as we get on the right-hand side, it's going to just be a little bit quieter. So don't forget those couple little ones hanging down in the background. I don't want to get those too bright. I backed off a little bit so you can kind of get the overall vantage of how it works together. I want to make sure that my lights and darks kind of balance out. And right now, I think the only really bright spot that is noticeable is on the kernels of corn. Had trouble with that little leaf or that edge of the husk that was folded down. I had to kind of fuss with that a little bit. Forgot that one back there. Make sure that they're not too much all the same. I almost ran into that. I kind of had to go back and touch some of them up so they weren't at the top just spaced out evenly. And I go back a little bit later on and I kind of address that issue. Picking up some black plum on the toe of my 1/4 inch angle. Just going to deepen that shading under the husk. We had that raw sienna or burnt sienna in there. It's just such a very transparent float. And this is a shadow underneath that husk. It's on that cob. So it's just going to be, shadow is very transparent. Don't let that become too powerful. And I did decide as I was doing this that I made the cob, shaded it really smooth. And I did go back and kind of bump up the edges a little bit so it looked more like that you could see each little kernel instead of a smooth edge. I kind of wasn't thinking when I did that. Now this is where I can really make those husks stand out, sharpen up those back in the background. This black plum is such a dynamic color. It works so well with every color that we have on our palette. It's just a beautiful color. Did want to deepen that shading in behind and adding it underneath the husk down the right sides and just there I go back and add a few little bumps where those rows of kernels are going to be extended. Just those little details that sometimes do make a big difference. And we have some more color to add in there that will enhance it, but if you do this in the beginning, it kind of, there we go. You can see the rows. Just one more thing that gives it more character. And make sure that that's very soft. It's translucent. It's not a heavy dark shadow. This is mostly water that I'm putting on. You can always go back and add more. It's just so much easier to keep it light because it's so amazing what a little bit of paint does. And that's kind of my motto. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. So if you overdo it from the beginning and you have to go back and remove some of that paint, it can be a very tedious process. So keep it light, put one layer on, let it dry, go back and look at it. And what I'm doing now is just darkening up at the top because these are going to be my deeper, darker shadows. Now I have all this bright kernels down on the cob, so we need to add some highlight in the husk up above. And I'm using bleach sand. This is going to look super bright. However, it's thin paint, so it's going to dry a lot lighter. We just want to make sure to brighten those up. And this is where you can add some fun detail. The highlights are what is really going to, that's your, when you look at it, that's what you do notice is the highlights. I have my number 5 radical round. And I'm just kind of going over to flatten that out and more or less dry brushing that to tone it down. But also when you dry brush, you get a really nice grainy texture, which is perfect for the husks because they have all those ridges running down. And don't forget down here, we can... Do you remember when I added the yellow ochre, it looks super bright? Well, now it doesn't look so very bright. This bleach sand's going to really make those highlights pop. And think about how the light's going to hit it. Stronger on the left side, the middle, and then a little bit lighter towards the right. Don't forget those husks hanging down. And I am being just a little more careful with the prior applications of paint. It's kind of loose and free, but with the highlights, you need to focus a little more on where they're going to be the strongest. Not everything will have the same intensity of highlight. Think how the light hits it and where it needs to stand out. Sometimes if you squint, it makes it really easy to see where the dull areas are. And where the areas just need a little bit of light to ramp them up. It only takes a few strokes. The one on the right, I just added, I think, 4 strokes there and a couple, because that's a little bit more in the shadow side, so it's not going to be nearly as strong. Don't let this back there get too bright. Black plum, if your highlights get too bright and you lose your darkness, that's what I'm doing now, just adding some more of that black plum in there just to help break it up so it doesn't look like a mass of brush strokes. And you can go back very easily and touch here and touch there just to add those highlights and shadow areas. There, that looks better. Make sure those at the top and the left side or on the right side kind of spill completely over the side so that you don't have a dead end. You want it to continue to flow. I just had a real tough time with that one hanging down. I kind of struggled with that one. A little more highlights on there, and sometimes you just have to stand back and look. You don't want so many highlights that you lose your focal point. So I'm not going to be real strong with the highlights up at the top. The corn's still going to be the focal point. Just need to balance it out, but not everywhere. You just have a few that are going to be outstanding. And those are ones that are going to have the strongest highlights on them. It's kind of fun to go back and forth. And those down there, once they dried, they weren't nearly as bright. So I'm just going to go back and put a second coat on. I said earlier, it's so much easier. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. So much easier to go back and add just a touch more than it is to put way too much on in the beginning and then try to figure out how in the world you're going to tone it down. But I will say acrylic paint is so easy to work with. I don't think there's anything that you cannot fix. So that's why I think using acrylic paints is so much fun. Adding some more brightness to these kernels. I want my highlights down in the corn to balance out with the highlights up in the husks. And make sure those are all super bright. They have the same light source, so they need to be balanced out. Such a great way to really define those rows of corn. And I'm using my number 2 Radical Round. I loved my number 5 so much that I had a number 2 made. And between the two brushes, they are amazing. If you need any of the supplies I do use today, they are available at my website, and everything is listed. It is listed below, cdwood.com. Went back to my number 5 Radical Round, and I'm adding a drop shadow. This is a great way to add really nice dimension, and it kind of lifts it off the background. This is a transparent float of, I should say, translucent float of black plum. And it's just going to, putting it down beside those hanging husks as well. Kind of lifts those off the background. But I'm putting it on the right side and below the ears of corn. Up above, the background's dark, so there's really no opportunity to put a drop shadow up above. But these little details really make a difference. Everything should have a drop shadow. Don't put it in one place if you're not going to do all of them. And the shading for the shadows needs to be even, and anywhere you put it needs to be the same value. Kind of winding down close to the end. Just going back. This is the fussy part, a little bit here and there. I picked up a little bit of Thicket. I love to add an unexpected color. Now, Thicket is kind of a blue-green. It is added into the shadow areas. We have all this rich, dark colors. The Thicket is just absolutely stunning. It brings a coolness to those shadows. It adds a lot of interest. It's absolutely gorgeous. So I'm adding a little bit of Thicket on the shaded parts of everything, the husks, mostly down in those shadow areas on the right-hand side. This is just a small touch of paint. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. Definitely add it back in those background ones along the sides of those. Just that little touch of paint is huge, absolutely huge. You don't want so much that it becomes overpowering, just little touches. And it just brings that warmth and that coolness in there that just kind of balances out all that warmth of the corn and those values. And they work together so well. It's kind of a dusty turquoise or blue-green, but Thicket is a beautiful color. I did another painting similar to this. It's a pumpkin and corn chalk. and that is called Autumn Pumpkin, and that is available as a pattern as well, and it will be listed below. What I'm doing now is adding just a little touch. Remember what I said about the side of the pumpkin not, or the corn not being even? Loaded the toe of my 1/4 inch angle, just kind of skipping down that right side of the cob of corn. Look what that does. And up in that top part where it was kind of dull, and just kind of hit and skip, and it looks like it just creates that super nice edge. I did add a teeny bit in that next row over in those dark areas. It's just amazing what it does. It just adds such a painterly touch. To me, that's what makes it. That is absolutely what sets it off. It's just amazing what that little bit of thicket will do to that. That's like the icing on the cake. And I think that corner was just a little bit too orange, so I'm putting a little bit of black plum in there to tone it down. And just start out light. If I decide I need to add more, I can go back and add more. I'm not bringing it up into the shadows. I just want to deepen that corner just a touch. And I'm going back with a little bit of bleached sand just to hit a few areas. If you have any uneven areas, you can go in with black plum, kind of chop in some black plum in there. This is where you straighten up any areas that you're not happy with. Look at all the color in there. It's just absolutely wonderful. I picked a little bit of raw sienna to fill that in. I thought it looked a little bit sparse, so I wanted to add a little more thickness. When you pull those husks up, they're really thick and full. A little bit of black plum to bring some more darkness in there. Just kind of play around with it. But be sure that you don't cover up all those beautiful colors. This is where I go in with the flat of my number 5 radical round. And you can see how when you flatten it out, you get that really nice texture. And it just brings a little more width to those husks that are up there. This is a painterly kind of a touch. And I'll keep the right hand side just a little more shadowy because I like to keep that darker over there. If it's bright everywhere, you lose your impact. So I think I'm finished. This is a close-up from top to bottom, and I think it turned out great. Surface and all supplies used are available at my website, as well as a printed pattern with complete instructions, color photo, and traceable. Click the link below. I love how this turned out and hope you give it a try. Please share your finished project on Facebook and be sure to tag me, Chris Hoy. I hope you learned some new tips, tricks, and techniques to make your painting life a little easier and a lot more fun. Please check out my other videos on YouTube. Share, like, and subscribe to my channel. Remember to hit the bell to be notified when my next video is created. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together.